What would you trade for your last chance at survival? For Aurelia Walsh, a widow fighting to keep her late husband's cattle ranch alive in the unforgiving mountains of Colorado Territory, the answer was her prized mare Tempest, a horse worth more than gold and the only thing standing between her family legacy and complete ruin. But when a dying Comanche warrior crawls to her doorstep in the dead of winter, Tempest's reins clutched in his frozen hands, the price he demands isn't money, land, or mercy. He asks for something far more dangerous. He asks to become her husband. This is not a tale of romance born from tender glances across a dance floor. This is a story forged in blood, desperation, and a debt that can only be paid with a life. This is a story where survival demands the unthinkable, and where two people from warring worlds must become one or watch everything they love burn to ash. The Colorado winter of 1876 came early and stayed late. A cruel season that tested every soul brave enough or foolish enough to call the high country home. For Aurelia Walsh, it was the third winter since her husband Thomas had been killed by a rock slide while moving cattle through Dead Man's Pass, and each season felt colder than the last. The ranch that Thomas had built with his own hands, the Cross Creek Ranch, sat in a valley carved between two mountain ridges. A pocket of grazing land fed by snowmelt streams and sheltered from the worst winds. It was prime territory, which meant it was coveted territory. And Aurelia knew that every day she managed to hold on to it was a small miracle wrapped in barbed wire and stubbornness. She was 27 years old, though the mirror sometimes reflected someone older. Her hair was the color of autumn wheat, usually pulled back in a severe braid that kept it out of her face during the endless hours of work. Her hands were no longer the soft hands of the Boston girl she'd been when she married Thomas at 19. They were calloused, strong, scarred from rope burns and fence mending and 100 small injuries that came with running a ranch alone. Her eyes were gray, the color of storm clouds, and they held a hardness that hadn't been there 3 years ago. Grief and determination had forged her into something tougher than the girl who'd arrived in Colorado Territory wearing silk gloves and carrying parasols. The ranch itself was modest by the standards of the cattle barons who ruled the territory, but it was hers. 200 acres of grazing land, a sturdy ranch house built from ponderosa pine, a barn that could shelter 30 head of cattle and a dozen horses, corrals, storage sheds, a smokehouse, and a well that never ran dry even in the worst droughts. Thomas had chosen the location perfectly, understanding water rights and wind patterns and the way snow accumulated in the high passes. He'd built something meant to last generations. He just hadn't lived long enough to see it flourish. Aurelia had 12 head of cattle left from the original herd of 50. Harsh winters, rustlers, and the constant need to sell stock just to pay for supplies had whittled away Thomas's legacy one animal at a time. She had 3 horses, a milk cow, 24 chickens, and one prized possession that made all the difference. Tempest, the mare, was a 6-year-old Morgan cross with a bloodline that traced back to the finest stables in Kentucky, a wedding gift from Thomas's father, who'd never approved of his son marrying a city girl, but had at least been generous in his disapproval. Tempest was coal black, with a white star on her forehead, standing 15 hands high with the muscled build of a horse bred for both speed and endurance. She was worth $300, maybe more to the right buyer, and she was the cornerstone of Aurelia's plan to rebuild the ranch. The plan was simple in theory, brutal in execution. Breed Tempest to the finest stallion in the territory. Sell the foal for enough money to buy a small breeding herd of cattle. Rebuild slowly but surely. It would take years, maybe a decade, but it was possible. Aurelia had already arranged the breeding for spring with a rancher named Samuel Cortland, who owned a champion quarter-horse stallion 40 miles south. The deal was struck, the terms agreed upon. All she had to do was survive the winter and get Tempest to Cortland's ranch when the mountain passes cleared. Everything depended on that horse. The trouble began on a Tuesday morning in late January, when the sky was the color of old pewter and the temperature hadn't climbed above freezing in 2 weeks. Aurelia woke before dawn, as she always did, lit the fire in the cast-iron stove, put coffee on to boil, and dressed in layers of wool and leather that made her look twice her actual size. She pulled on her boots, Thomas's old sheepskin coat that still smelled faintly of him, and a wide-brimmed hat that kept the snow out of her eyes. She grabbed the Winchester rifle that lived by the door, a habit Thomas had drilled into her, never go outside unarmed, and stepped out into the frozen morning. The air was so cold it burned her lungs. Her breath came out in white plumes that hung in the stillness before dissipating. The valley was quiet, unnaturally quiet, the kind of silence that made the hair on the back of her neck stand up. Something was wrong. She could feel it in her bones the way animals sense earthquakes before they hit. She walked toward the barn, her boots crunching on snow that had frozen into a hard crust overnight, and that's when she saw it. The barn door was open, swinging slightly in the faint breeze, and the snow around it was churned up and tracked with boot prints. Not her boots, bigger boots, men's boots, multiple sets. Her heart dropped into her stomach. She ran the last 30 feet, skidding on ice, and burst through the barn door with the rifle raised. The interior was dim, lit only by the grey dawn filtering through gaps in the boards. The cattle were still there, huddled together for warmth and eyeing her nervously. The chickens were roosting undisturbed, but Tempest's stall was empty. The gate hung open, the halter and lead rope were gone, and in the dirt floor of the stall she saw more boot prints, the marks of a struggle, hoof prints that had scraped and gouged the earth as Tempest fought whoever had taken her. Aurelia's vision went white at the edges. Rage and fear battled for control of her thoughts. She forced herself to breathe, to think like Thomas had taught her. Panic kills. Clear thinking saves lives. She studied the tracks. 3 men, maybe 4. They'd come in through the rear door of the barn, which meant they'd scouted the property beforehand and knew the layout. Professional horse thieves, not opportunistic drifters. They'd taken only Tempest, which meant they knew exactly what they were stealing. This was targeted, planned, and that meant someone had told them about her horse. She followed the tracks outside. They led north, up toward the tree line, where the forest began its climb into the high country. The thieves had at least a 6-hour head start, maybe more. They'd come in the dead of night while she slept, had moved with enough skill to avoid waking her, and were probably miles away by now. Tracking them alone in winter in the mountains would be suicide, but waiting for help would mean losing Tempest forever. Horse thieves moved fast, and Colorado territory was vast, with 1,000 places to hide stolen livestock until the trail went cold. By the time she could ride to the nearest town and convince the territorial marshal to form a posse, Tempest would be sold, rebranded, and lost. Aurelia stood in the snow, rifle in hand, and felt the weight of impossible choices pressing down on her shoulders. She couldn't track them alone. She couldn't afford to wait for help. She couldn't lose Tempest, and she couldn't save the ranch without that horse. The plan, the future, Thomas's legacy, everything balanced on the back of a stolen mare, being led into the wilderness by men who saw her only as profit. She tilted her head back and looked at the grey sky, searching for answers that didn't come, and then she did the only thing she could do. She went back inside, packed supplies, saddled one of her remaining horses, a sturdy gelding named Flint, and prepared to track Tempest herself even if it killed her. She was loading her saddlebags when she heard the church bells from town, 6 miles east across the valley. They were ringing in a pattern she recognized. 3 long peals, pause, 3 more pause, 3 more. Emergency, danger, all able-bodied men to the church. It was the signal used when there was an Indian raid, a fire, or some other crisis that required immediate community response. Aurelia hesitated, torn between her own emergency and whatever was happening in town. But she was a member of this community, and Thomas had taught her that neighbors help neighbors no matter what. She secured her saddlebags, mounted Flint, and rode hard toward the town of Redemption. Redemption was barely worthy of the name town. It consisted of one main street, lined with false front buildings. A general store, a blacksmith, a saloon, a church with a crooked steeple, a tiny schoolhouse, the marshal's office, and maybe 24 homes scattered in the surrounding area. The population swelled to nearly 100 souls when you counted all the ranchers and homesteaders in the valley. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business, where feuds lasted generations, and where survival depended on cooperation even when you despised your neighbor. Aurelia had never quite fit in. She was an outsider, an Easterner, a woman running a ranch alone, and while people were polite to her face, she knew what they said behind her back. Too proud, too stubborn, thinks she's better than us, should sell the ranch and move back east where she belongs. When she arrived in town, a crowd had already gathered outside the church. Men with rifles, women with worried faces, children peeking around their mothers' skirts. Marshal Tobias Kane stood on the church steps, a tall man in his 50s with iron-grey hair and a face weathered by decades in the territory. He was a fair man. Thomas had respected him, but he was also practical to the point of ruthlessness. He dealt with problems in the most efficient way possible, and he didn't waste resources on lost causes. The marshal raised his hands for silence. "Folks, we got a situation. Bill Henderson was riding fence line this morning up near Copper Ridge and found tracks. Unshod ponies, at least a dozen, maybe more, heading south from the high country. Could be Comanche, could be Ute, could be Arapaho. Don't matter which. What matters is they're moving through our territory, and that means we need to be ready for trouble. I want every man with a rifle to volunteer for patrol shifts. We'll ride the perimeter of the valley in teams, keep eyes on the mountain passes, and make sure our families are safe. Any question?" a voice called out from the crowd. "How long we talking, Marshal? Some of us got stock to tend. Can't be riding patrol for weeks." "As long as it takes," Kane replied. "Could be a day, could be a week. These bands move fast when they're hunting or raiding, but they also move on when they don't find what they want. We show strength, we stay vigilant, and they'll pass us by." Another voice, this one belonging to a rancher named Dutch Carmody, a man who owned land adjacent to Aurelia's. "What about the widow Walsh? She's out there alone. Someone should check on her." Aurelia felt every eye turn toward her. She stepped forward, her chin lifted. "I can take care of myself, Dutch, but I appreciate the concern." Marshal Kane's gaze settled on her, assessing. "Mrs. Walsh, with all due respect, you're in a vulnerable position. No hands, no protection. Might be wise to come stay in town until this blows over." "I can't leave my stock unattended, Marshal. I've got cattle and horses that need feeding." "Horses," Kane repeated, and something shifted in his expression. "Speaking of which, I heard from Samuel Cortland yesterday. He sent a rider asking if you'd changed your mind about the breeding arrangement. Said he hadn't heard from you in a month and wanted to confirm the deal was still on." Aurelia's stomach tightened. "The deal's still on. I'll be bringing Tempest south as soon as the pass is clear." Kane nodded slowly. "A good horse, that mare. Valuable. You keeping her secure?" There it was, the question she didn't want to answer. But lying would only make things worse when the truth came out. "She was stolen last night. 3, maybe 4 men. Took her right out of my barn while I slept. I was about to track them when I heard the bells." The crowd erupted in murmurs. Kane's face hardened. "Horse thieves? You sure it wasn't Indians?" "Boot prints, Marshal. White men, professionals. Did you see them?" "Can you identify them?" "No, I found the tracks at dawn. They had a 6-hour head start, heading north into the high country." Kane shook his head. "North? That's rough terrain in winter. They're either desperate or stupid." He paused, calculating. "Mrs. Walsh, I can't spare men for a posse right now. Not with a potential Indian raid on our hands. Horse thieves are bad, but a massacre's worse. You understand?" Aurelia understood perfectly. She was low priority. Again, "I understand, Marshal. I'll handle it myself." "You'll do no such thing," Kane said sharply. "A woman alone in those mountains in winter, tracking armed men? That's suicide. You'll stay in town where it's safe, and when this Indian situation resolves, I'll organize a proper search." "That's an order." "You can't order me to abandon my property, Marshal. I can when it's for your own safety and the safety of this community." We don't need to be worrying about rescuing you from your own foolishness while we're trying to protect everyone else." The words stung because they were designed to. Aurelia felt her face flush hot despite the cold. "That horse is my livelihood, Marshal. Without her, I lose everything. The ranch, Thomas's legacy, my future. I can't just sit here and wait." "You can and you will," Kane said, his tone final. "Dutch, you and your boys keep an eye on the Walsh place while she's in town. Make sure nothing else gets stolen. Mrs. Walsh, you'll stay at the boarding house. I'll have someone fetch your essentials from the ranch." It wasn't a suggestion. It was a command, backed by the authority of the law and the collective will of the community. Aurelia could defy him, could ride out anyway, but then she'd be on her own if anything went wrong. No help, no sympathy. Just another stubborn woman who'd gotten herself killed. She swallowed her pride and nodded. "Thank you, Marshal." She spent the rest of the day in a fog of helpless rage. The boarding house was run by a widow named Mrs. Hennessy, a kind woman who clucked sympathetically and offered tea and biscuits that Aurelia couldn't stomach. She sat in the small room she'd been given, staring out the window at the mountains, where Tempest was being taken farther and farther away with every passing hour. The window glass was cold against her forehead. Outside, men rode past in patrol groups, rifles across their saddles, their breath and their horses' breath creating clouds in the frigid air. The town had mobilized for the Indian threat. No one mobilized for her. Night fell. The temperature dropped even further. Aurelia lay on the narrow bed, fully clothed, staring at the ceiling. She thought about Thomas, about the way he'd promised her a future here in this wild place. She thought about all the work she'd put into keeping his dream alive. She thought about Tempest, cold and frightened, being led through darkness by men who saw her only as merchandise. And she thought about the impossible choice she faced: obey the Marshal and lose everything, or defy him and likely die trying to save it. She was still awake at midnight when she heard the commotion outside, shouting, running footsteps, the sound of horses being led at a fast walk. She got up and looked out the window. A group of men were gathered in the street, lanterns held high, and in the center of the group was a horse. A black horse with a white star. Tempest. And slumped over Tempest's neck, barely conscious, was a man. Even from this distance, even in the poor light, Aurelia could see the blood. His shirt was soaked with it. His face was pale as bone, and his hands, frozen into claws, still gripped Tempest's reins. Aurelia didn't remember running down the stairs. She didn't remember pushing through the crowd. She only remembered reaching Tempest's side and looking up at the man who'd brought her horse home. He was young, maybe 30, with long black hair and high cheekbones and skin the color of old copper. He was Comanche. There was no mistaking it. The deerskin leggings, the beadwork on what remained of his shirt, the way he sat a horse even while dying. And his eyes, dark as midnight, found hers through the pain and the cold and the press of hostile faces. He spoke, his voice barely a whisper, rough with exhaustion and blood loss. "I bring your horse back. I ask one thing. Marry me." The crowd exploded. Men shouted. Women gasped. Marshal Kane pushed forward, his hand on his pistol. "Get him down from there. Someone fetch the doctor." Mrs. Walsh stepped back, but Aurelia didn't step back. She reached up and took Tempest's reins from the man's hands, and as she did, he fell, simply let go and fell sideways out of the saddle. She tried to catch him, but he was too heavy. He hit the frozen ground with a sound that made her wince. Blood spread beneath him, black in the lantern light. His eyes closed. And Aurelia Walsh, widow and rancher and woman who'd learned to be hard because the world demanded it, made a decision that would change her life forever. "Get him inside," she said. Now Marshal Kane stared at her. "Mrs. Walsh, that's a Comanche. Do you understand what you're saying?" "I understand that he risked his life to bring my horse back," Aurelia said, her voice cold and clear. "And I understand that if he dies in this street, it'll be on all our consciences. Get him inside. That's not a request." They carried Tahitian into the back room of the general store, which doubled as the town's makeshift clinic when Doc Pritchard made his monthly rounds. Unfortunately, Doc Pritchard was 40 miles south, treating a mining camp outbreak of pneumonia, which meant Aurelia and the town were on their own. Marshal Kane ordered 2 men to clear the examination table while Mrs. Hennessy fetched hot water, clean linens, and what passed for medical supplies in redemption. The room smelled of gun oil, tobacco, and the metallic tang of blood that was spreading across the floorboards faster than anyone wanted to acknowledge. Aurelia knelt beside Taherton as they laid him on the table. His breathing was shallow and rapid, the kind of breathing that signaled the body shutting down from blood loss. His skin had gone grey beneath the copper tone, and when she pressed her fingers to his neck, his pulse was thready and weak. She'd seen men die before, Thomas among them, and she recognized the signs. This man had maybe an hour, possibly less, unless someone did something drastic. She began unbuttoning his shirt with hands that remained steady through sheer force of will, and what she found beneath made her stomach turn. 3 wounds. A bullet hole through his left shoulder, the entry wound small, but the exit wound the size of a silver dollar. A knife slash across his ribs that had opened him nearly to the bone. And worst of all, a deep puncture in his side just above his hip. Something that had driven in and twisted, probably a hunting knife, and had almost certainly nicked something vital. The amount of blood he'd lost was staggering. The fact that he'd stayed conscious long enough to bring Tempest home and propose marriage was beyond comprehension. It spoke to a will that refused to acknowledge physical limitations. Marshal Kane stood in the doorway, arms crossed, his face carved from granite. "Mrs. Walsh, what exactly do you think you're doing?" "Saving his life," Aurelia replied without looking up. She accepted a basin of hot water from Mrs. Hennessy and began cleaning the wounds to assess the damage more clearly. Or trying to. That's a Comanche warrior who just rode into our town during a potential Indian raid. For all we know, he's a scout for a war party. He's a dying man who brought back my stolen horse, Aurelia countered. She probed the shoulder wound gently, and Taherton's eyes fluttered, but didn't open. If he wanted to scout us, Marshal, he wouldn't have ridden straight down Main Street half dead and asked to marry me. Someone in the crowd of onlookers that had gathered outside the door laughed nervously. Kane's jaw tightened. "About that. You can't seriously be considering his proposal. I haven't considered anything except stopping him from bleeding to death on your examination table." Aurelia pressed clean cloth against the worst of the wounds, applying pressure. The bleeding slowed but didn't stop. She needed to stitch him closed. But she'd never sutured a human being before, only animals, and the scale of these injuries terrified her. One wrong move, and she could kill him faster than the wounds themselves. "I need needle and thread. Surgical if you have it, sewing thread if you don't, and whiskey." A lot of whiskey. Mrs. Hennessy, bless her practical soul, didn't wait for the marshal's permission. She hurried off and returned with a needle that had been boiled clean, catgut thread that the veterinarian used on horses, and a full bottle of rye whiskey. Aurelia poured whiskey directly into the shoulder wound, and Taherton's entire body went rigid. His eyes snapped open, wild with pain, and his hand shot out and grabbed her wrist with surprising strength for a dying man. For a moment they locked eyes, grey meeting black, and Aurelia saw something in his gaze that wasn't anger or threat. It was a question. "Do you mean to help me or finish me?" "I'm helping," she said quietly, firmly. "But this is going to hurt." He held her gaze for another heartbeat, then slowly released her wrist and closed his eyes again. His jaw clenched so tight she could see the muscles jumping beneath his skin. She took that as permission and got to work. Threading the needle took 3 tries because her hands had finally started shaking. She took a breath, steadied herself, and began stitching the knife wound across his ribs. The flesh was warm and slick with blood. The needle pierced skin that felt too much like leather and too much like silk at the same time. She worked with small, careful stitches, the way her mother had taught her to embroider samplers in Boston a lifetime ago, never imagining those lessons would one day be used to sew a man's body back together. Taherton made no sound. Not a gasp, not a moan, nothing. His silence was more unnerving than screaming would have been. She stitched the rib wound closed, tied off the thread, and moved to the puncture in his side. This one was deeper, uglier, and when she poured whiskey into it, blood and something darker welled up. Internal bleeding, possibly a perforated intestine. If that was the case, infection would set in within days and kill him no matter what she did. But she stitched it anyway, pulling the ragged edges of flesh together and closing the wound as best she could. Her hands were covered in his blood. Her sleeves were soaked with it. The room had gone silent except for her breathing and his and the whisper of thread through skin. When she finished, she wrapped his torso in clean bandages, layering them thick to keep pressure on the wounds. He'd lost so much blood that his lips were nearly white. She checked his pulse again. Weaker than before, fading. There was nothing more she could do except wait and see if his body had enough strength left to fight. She stepped back from the table, her legs suddenly unsteady, and Mrs. Hennessy caught her elbow. "You did good, dear. That's fine work. Finer than most doctors could manage. It won't matter if he dies anyway," Aurelia said, her voice hollow. She looked down at her hands, at the blood drying between her fingers, and felt a wave of exhaustion crash over her so hard she nearly collapsed. How long had it been since she'd slept? Since she'd eaten? The world tilted and Marshal Kane was suddenly there, gripping her other arm, steering her toward a chair. She sat heavily, and someone pressed a cup of water into her hands. She drank without tasting it. The crowd in the doorway had grown. Every able-bodied person in Redemption seemed to have materialized to witness the spectacle. Aurelia could feel their eyes on her, could hear the whispers, even though no one spoke loud enough for her to make out words. The widow Walsh stitching up a Comanche. The widow Walsh accepting a marriage proposal from a savage. The widow Walsh finally losing her mind from grief and isolation. She didn't have the energy to care what they thought. Let them whisper, let them judge. She'd done what needed doing, and she'd do it again. Marshal Kane cleared his throat. "Folks, show's over. Everyone go home. We still got patrol shifts to cover, and this situation doesn't change that. Move along." He used his authority voice, the one that didn't invite argument, and slowly the crowd dispersed. When the room had cleared, except for Mrs. Hennessy and Dutch Carmody, who'd apparently appointed himself Aurelia's unofficial guardian, Kane pulled up a chair and sat across from her. His face was impossible to read. "You want to tell me what happened out there? How a Comanche warrior ended up with your stolen horse?" Aurelia set down the water cup. Her hands had finally stopped shaking. "I don't know, Marshal. I wasn't there. But I can guess. Guess then." She gathered her thoughts, trying to piece together a narrative that made sense. The men who stole Tempest headed north into the high country. That's Comanche territory, or close enough. They probably ran into him, or he ran into them. Maybe there was a fight. Maybe he killed them and took the horse. Maybe he traded for her. I don't know. But somehow he ended up with Tempest, and instead of keeping her, he brought her back to me. And given the state he's in, I'd say he fought hard to do it. Dutch Carmody, a burly man with a grey beard and kind eyes, shook his head slowly. That doesn't make a lick of sense. Why would a Comanche risk his life to return a stolen horse to a white woman? His people and ours have been killing each other for decades. He should have kept the horse, or sold her, or used her to buy guns. Unless he has honor, Aurelia said quietly. Unless returning stolen property matters to him. Unless he's not what we've been taught to expect, Kane snorted. Honor from a Comanche. That's a generous interpretation, Mrs. Walsh. You have a better one? I think he's a scout who got caught in a bad situation, stumbled across your horse, and saw an opportunity. He brings the horse back, makes a grand gesture, gets taken in by the white settlement, and gathers intelligence for his war band. Then when he's recovered, he slips away and leads a raid straight to our doorsteps. It was plausible. Cynical, but plausible. Aurelia looked at Tehetan's unconscious form on the table, at the careful way Mrs. Hennessy was adjusting his blankets, and tried to see him through Kane's eyes. A threat, a spy, an enemy using her compassion against her. But all she could see was a man who'd nearly died, bringing her the one thing that mattered most to her survival. Actions spoke louder than assumptions. Thomas had taught her that. Judge a man by what he does, not by what others fear he might do. What about his proposal? Mrs. Hennessy asked, ever practical. He asked you to marry him, dear, in front of witnesses. That's a binding offer according to territorial law. Aurelia blinked. She'd almost forgotten about that in the chaos of trying to save his life. He was delirious from blood loss. It doesn't count. It counts if he meant it, Kane said. And if you accept, it makes him a legal resident of this territory with all the rights and protections that entails, including the right to stay on your ranch. As your husband, the implications crashed down on Aurelia like an avalanche. If she accepted Tahitian's proposal, she'd be binding herself to a complete stranger from a people her society considered enemies. She'd be inviting scandal, ostracism, and possibly violence from her own community. But she'd also be gaining something she desperately needed, a partner. Someone strong enough to help her run the ranch, defend it, rebuild it. Someone who'd proven, however inexplicably, that he valued honor enough to risk everything. It was insane. It was dangerous. It was possibly the only chance she had. I need time to think, she said finally. And he needs time to recover. If he recovers, let's see if he survives the night before we worry about marriage contracts. Kane stood, his chair scraping against the floorboards. Fair enough. But Mrs. Walsh, understand this. If he lives, I'll be watching him closely. One wrong move, one hint of threat, and I'll put him down like a rabid dog. I don't care if he's your husband, your hired hand, or the second coming of Christ. My job is protecting this town, and I won't let sentiment compromise that. Are we clear? Crystal clear, Marshal. Good. Dutch, you stay here tonight. Keep watch. If he wakes up, if he tries anything, you shoot first, and ask questions never. Mrs. Walsh, you should go back to the boarding house and get some rest. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Aurelia shook her head. I'm staying. I stitched him up. I'm responsible for him now. Kane looked like he wanted to argue, but something in her face must have convinced him it would be pointless. He sighed, adjusted his gun belt, and headed for the door. Suit yourself. But don't come crying to me when this blows up in your face. He paused at the threshold and looked back. For what it's worth, you've got grit, Mrs. Walsh. Thomas would be proud of the woman you've become. Just wish you'd use that grit on something less likely to get you killed. After he left, the room fell into an exhausted quiet. Mrs. Hennessy fussed over Tahitian for a few more minutes, checking his bandages and his pulse, then declared she needed to return to the boarding house before her other guests started complaining. She squeezed Aurelia's shoulder on her way out. You did a brave thing tonight, dear. Don't let anyone tell you different. Dutch settled into a chair in the corner, his rifle across his lap, and pulled his hat down over his eyes. Within minutes he was snoring softly. Aurelia was alone with her thoughts and a dying Comanche warrior who'd somehow become her responsibility. She pulled a stool close to the examination table and sat, studying Tahitian's face in the lamplight. He was younger than she'd first thought, maybe her age or close to it. His features were strong and angular, carved with the kind of precision that made him handsome, despite the pallor and the pain etched into the lines around his mouth. His hair was long and black as midnight, matted with blood and sweat. There was a scar along his jawline, old and faded, and another across his collarbone. A warrior's marks. A survivor's marks? She found herself wondering about his life. Where had he grown up? What had shaped him? Did he have family waiting for him somewhere, wondering if he was alive or dead? Had he known what taking Tempest back to her would cost him? And why had he done it? The question gnawed at her. Bringing back a stolen horse to a stranger made no sense, unless there was something she was missing, some piece of the puzzle she couldn't see. Maybe when he woke up, if he woke up, she'd get answers. Or maybe she'd just get more questions. The night stretched on. Aurelia dozed in her chair, jerking awake every time Tahitian's breathing changed rhythm. Around midnight, his fever spiked. His skin went hot to the touch, and he started trembling despite the blankets piled on him. She bathed his face with cool water and whispered reassurances she wasn't sure he could hear. You're safe. You're going to live. Just hold on. Whether she was reassuring him or herself, she couldn't say. Dawn came slowly, grey light seeping through the window and painting the room in shades of exhaustion. Tahitian's fever broke an hour after sunrise. His breathing evened out. His colour improved slightly. He was still unconscious, but the crisis had passed. He'd survived the night. Dutch woke with a snort, stretched, and went outside to relieve himself and check on the town. When he came back, he had news. Marshall's got patrols reporting all clear. No sign of Indian activity. Looks like whatever band was moving through has moved on. Kane's calling off the emergency. Aurelia felt a weight lift slightly. At least that crisis was over. What about the horse thieves? Anyone find their trail? Not yet. But with your horse back, I reckon that mystery's solved itself. Whoever took her is probably buzzard food up in the high country, courtesy of your Comanche friend there. He's not my friend. He's just a man who returned my property. That's so? Dutch gave her a knowing look. You sat up all night nursing a man who's just a stranger. That's mighty charitable of you, Mrs. Walsh. She didn't have an answer for that. Maybe it was charity. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was the bone-deep loneliness of 3 years alone, finally breaking through her defenses. She didn't know anymore. Dutch seemed to sense her turmoil and softened. I'm not judging Aurelia. Thomas was my friend. I promised him I'd look after you if anything happened to him, and I've done a poor job of it. If this Comanche can help you keep the ranch, if he's honorable, then maybe it's not such a crazy idea. But you be careful. The town won't take kindly to you marrying outside your kind. There'll be talk. Worse than talk. There's already talk, Aurelia said. There has been since Thomas died. I've learned to live with it. This'll be different. This'll be dangerous. Kane won't be the only one watching. Some folks might decide to take matters into their own hands. The warning was clear. If she accepted Tahitian's proposal, she'd be painting a target on both their backs. The question was whether the risk was worth the reward. Dutch left to fetch breakfast, and Aurelia remained at Tahitian's side. Around mid-morning his eyes opened. Just a crack at first, then wider as awareness returned. He looked confused, disoriented, and then his gaze found hers and sharpened, recognition, memory. His lips moved, but no sound came out. His throat was too dry. She lifted his head carefully and held a cup of water to his mouth. He drank in small sips, grimacing with pain from the movement. When he'd had enough, she set the cup aside and met his eyes. You almost died. You've been unconscious for nearly 12 hours. Do you remember what happened? He nodded slightly. His voice, when it came, was rough as gravel. I remember. Your horse. Men who stole her. I killed them. Took your horse back. Came to find you. Why? The question hung between them. Tahitian was silent for a long moment, his eyes searching her face as if trying to decide how much truth to share. Finally he spoke. Because it was the right thing to do. Because honor demands debts be paid. What debt? You didn't owe me anything. I owed myself, he said quietly. I have lost much. My people scattered. My family dead. My purpose gone. When I found those men with your horse, I saw a chance to be more than I have become. I saw a chance to matter, to do something good. And when I brought your horse back, I saw a chance for something more. A future, a place, a reason to keep living. His honesty was stark and painful. Aurelia understood loss. She understood the feeling of your entire world, crumbling and searching desperately for something to hold on to. You asked me to marry you, she said, in front of the whole town. Do you remember that? I remember. Did you mean it? Tahitian's eyes held hers. I meant it. I offer you my strength, my skills, my loyalty. I ask only for a place to belong. If that is not enough, I will leave when I am healed. But I hope it is enough. Aurelia felt something shift in her chest. This wasn't romance. It wasn't passion. It was something raw and more honest. Two broken people recognizing in each other a chance at survival. She thought about the ranch, about the impossible weight of running it alone. She thought about Thomas's dream and her promise to keep it alive. She thought about the brutal practicality of frontier life, where marriages were often partnerships forged out of necessity rather than love. And she thought about the risk, the danger, the scandal. Then she made her choice. My name is Aurelia Walsh, she said. I'm a widow. I own a cattle ranch called Cross Creek about 6 miles west of here. It's 200 acres, not much, but it's mine. I have 12 head of cattle, 3 horses including the one you brought back, and more problems than I can count. If you marry me, you'll be working dawn to dusk. You'll be facing hostility from the town, and possibly violence from people who don't want you here. You'll be bound to me and to that land for better or worse. It's not an easy life. It's not even a good life most days. But it's honest work, and it's a chance to build something that matters. Is that what you want? Tahitian smiled, just slightly, and it transformed his face from hard to something almost gentle. That is exactly what I want. Then yes, Aurelia said, her heart pounding. I accept your proposal. We'll be married as soon as you're strong enough to stand. I can stand now, he said, and started to push himself up. Pain lanced across his face and he fell back with a gasp. Aurelia pressed him down gently but firmly. You can stand when you're healed. We have time. The ranch isn't going anywhere, and neither am I. Tahitian relaxed, nodding. Thank you, Aurelia Walsh. I will not fail you. See that you don't, she said, but there was no harshness in it. Just exhaustion and relief, and the strange sense that she'd just stepped off a cliff and was somehow still flying. Outside, the town of Redemption was waking to a new day. Inside, 2 strangers had made a bargain that would bind their fates together. For better or worse, in a world that wouldn't make it easy, they would face what came next together. Tahitian healed with a speed that defied both logic and medical expectation. Within 3 days, he was sitting up and taking solid food. Within a week, he was walking short distances with only a slight limp. Within 2 weeks, the wounds had closed cleanly with minimal scarring, and he was insisting he was ready for ranch work. Doc Pritchard, who'd finally returned from the mining camp, examined him with professional skepticism and grudging admiration. I've seen men die from less, the doctor muttered, probing the shoulder wound that had already knitted itself into pink scar tissue. Whatever blood runs in your veins, son, it's got some powerful healing in it. The town's reaction to the impending marriage ranged from scandalized whispers to outright hostility. The church reverend, a stern man named Tobias Blackwell, refused to perform the ceremony, citing scripture about being unequally yoked with unbelievers. The territorial judge, who rode circuit through Redemption once a month, declined to officiate on grounds that he wasn't certain a union between a white woman and a Comanche warrior was legally valid under territorial law. It took Marshal Kane's intervention, driven more by pragmatism than approval, to find a solution. There was a retired justice of the peace living 20 miles north who owed Kane a favor and was willing to perform a civil ceremony with no questions asked. The wedding was scheduled for the last Saturday in February, exactly 18 days after Tahitian had collapsed in the street with Tempest's reins in his hands. Aurelia spent those 18 days in a state of controlled chaos. She returned to Cross Creek Ranch with Tahitian against Doc Pritchard's advice and Marshal Kane's stern warnings. The ranch needed tending, and she'd already lost too much time. Dutch Carmody and his 2 sons helped move Tahitian's few belongings, which consisted of nothing more than the blood-stained clothes he'd arrived in and a leather pouch containing a handful of items that seemed to hold significance. A small carved stone in the shape of a bear, a braid of sweetgrass wrapped in red thread, a silver coin worn smooth with age. He didn't explain their meaning, and Aurelia didn't ask. Some things were private, and she understood the need to hold pieces of yourself back, even when offering everything else. The ranch house was small but sturdy, built from pine logs chinked with clay and designed to withstand the brutal mountain winters. It consisted of a main room that served as kitchen and living space, a bedroom that had been hers and Thomas's, a small storage room, and a loft accessible by ladder that Thomas had intended to turn into a second bedroom, but never finished. Aurelia gave Tahitian the loft. It seemed the safest arrangement for 2 strangers about to become legally bound. He accepted without comment, climbing the ladder with visible effort that he tried to hide, and she heard him moving around up there, arranging the bedding she'd provided. That first night back at the ranch, she lay awake in her own bed, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of another person in the house. His breathing, his occasional movements. the creak of floorboards under weight. It should have felt threatening. Instead, it felt strange and sad and oddly comforting. They fell into a routine dictated by necessity and mutual wariness. Aurelia woke before dawn as she always had, and started the fire in the cast-iron stove. By the time Tehiton climbed down from the loft, she had coffee boiling and cornmeal mush cooking. They ate in silence, not the comfortable silence of long familiarity, but the careful silence of two people trying not to intrude on each other's space. After breakfast, she assigned him tasks suited to his healing body. Chopping firewood, which he did with an economy of motion that spoke of long practice. Mending fence posts, which he approached with methodical patience. Checking the cattle, which he did with a quiet competence that surprised her. He knew animals. He understood their behavior and their needs. He moved through the ranch work like someone who'd done similar labor all his life, just in a different context. On the fourth day, she found him in the barn, talking to Tempest. He was speaking in his own language, low and melodic, and the mare was calm under his hands in a way she rarely was with strangers. Aurelia stood in the doorway watching, and when he noticed her, he didn't stop or look embarrassed. He simply switched to English. She is a good horse. Strong spirit. She fought the men who took her. That is how I knew she belonged to someone who valued her. How did you find them? Aurelia asked. She'd been wanting to know since he'd woken, but hadn't found the right moment to ask. The men who stole her. Tahitan's hand stilled on Tempest's neck. I was hunting. 3 days north of here. I heard gunfire and went to see. Found them camped in a box canyon, arguing over how to split their take. They had your horse and 2 others. When I got closer, I saw they were not just horse thieves. They had other things. Women's jewelry, children's toys, a Bible with a family name written inside. These were not men who stole only horses. They stole from families. Killed them, maybe. I could not let that stand. The casual way he said it sent a chill down Aurelia's spine. You killed all 3 of them by yourself. 4, there were 4 men, and yes, I killed them. His eyes met hers, dark and unreadable. Does that trouble you? It should have. Aurelia knew it should have. But she thought about the kind of men who would steal a woman's horse, knowing it might mean her starvation. Men who would carry stolen children's toys like trophies. And she found she couldn't summon outrage over their deaths. No, she said finally, it doesn't trouble me. They made their choices and you made yours. Thank you for bringing Tempest home. I never properly said that. You saved my life. That is, thanks enough. I couldn't let you die in the street after what you'd done. That would have been dishonorable. A ghost of a smile crossed his face. We are a pair then. 2 people trying to live with honor in a world that makes it difficult. Yes, Aurelia agreed. I suppose we are. Something shifted between them in that moment, a recognition of kinship that went deeper than their arrangement. They were both survivors, both people who'd lost everything and were trying to build something from the ruins. The marriage might be one of convenience, but the respect was real. The days passed quickly. Tahitan's presence on the ranch changed things in ways Aurelia hadn't anticipated. Tasks that had taken her hours now took half the time with 2 sets of hands. The cattle were moved to better grazing. The water troughs were repaired. The barn roof that had been leaking for 2 years was finally patched properly. He worked with a quiet intensity that required no supervision, and when he didn't know how something should be done, he asked rather than guessing wrong. He was learning not just the ranch, but her, the way she liked things organized, the standards she held, the reasons behind her methods, and she found herself learning him in return. He was patient with animals, but had little tolerance for broken equipment. He could track a deer through snow that left no visible prints. He could predict weather changes hours before they arrived. He had a dry sense of humor that emerged rarely, but hit with unexpected impact. One morning, she came outside to find him standing perfectly still, watching the eastern horizon. The sun was just rising, painting the snow-covered peaks in shades of gold and rose. "What are you looking at?"
she asked.
He didn't turn. Home, or what used to be home. My people's winter camps were 2 days' ride that direction. I am wondering if any of them still stand, or if the soldiers have burned them all." The pain in his voice was carefully controlled but unmistakable. Aurelia stood beside him, following his gaze. "I'm sorry for what you've lost, for what my people have taken from yours. You did not take anything from me, my people did. That makes me complicit whether I pulled a trigger or not." Tahitian finally looked at her, his expression thoughtful. "By that logic, I am complicit in every raid my people made against yours. Every settler killed, every home burned. Should you hate me for that? I don't know," Aurelia said honestly. "Should I? No, because I am not my people any more than you are yours. We are just two individuals trying to survive. The weight of history is too heavy for two people to carry. Let the dead bury the dead. We will focus on living." It was good advice, practical advice, but Aurelia wondered if either of them could actually follow it. The past had teeth, and it didn't let go easily. Still, she nodded, agreed. We focus on the future, on this ranch, on making something that lasts. They stood together watching the sunrise until the cold drove them back inside, and Aurelia felt the first fragile thread of partnership beginning to form between them. The wedding day arrived with clear skies and temperatures that almost climbed above freezing. Aurelia wore the only dress she owned that wasn't work-worn, a dark blue wool that had been her mother's and still smelled faintly of lavender. She braided her hair and pinned it up, and when she looked in the small mirror above the wash basin, she barely recognized herself. She looked young and frightened and determined all at once. Tahitian emerged from the loft, wearing clothes that Dutch Carmody had donated, a white shirt and black trousers that fit reasonably well, and his long hair tied back with a strip of leather. He looked uncomfortable in the white man's clothing, but he wore it without complaint. They rode to the justice of the Peace's property together on Flint and Tempest, the horses moving at an easy walk through snow that had crusted overnight. Neither of them spoke much. What was there to say? They both knew what they were doing and why. Love had nothing to do with it. This was a business arrangement, a partnership forged from necessity. But as they rode, Aurelia found herself studying Tahitian from the corner of her eye. He sat a horse beautifully, moving with the animal rather than against it. His profile was sharp against the white landscape. He'd be handsome if circumstances were different, if he were just a man, and she were just a woman, without all the complications of history and culture between them. But circumstances were what they were. The justice of the peace was a grizzled man named Silas Montgomery, who lived in a cabin that leaned slightly to the left and smelled of wood smoke and whiskey. He took one look at them, grunted, and pulled out a battered book of territorial law. "Marshal Kane said you needed a civil ceremony. No frills, that what you want?" "Yes, sir," Aurelia said. "That's what we want. You understand this is legally binding. You're entering into a contract recognized by territorial law. Property becomes shared, debts become shared. You're bound until death or legal dissolution. You sure about this?" Aurelia looked at Tahitian. He looked back at her. "We're sure," they said in unison. Montgomery shrugged. "Your funeral. Let's get this done. I got traps to check before nightfall." The ceremony took less than 5 minutes. Montgomery read from the law book in a monotone, asked them each if they consented to the union, and when they both said yes, he made them sign a document that he'd already prepared. "Witnessed and signed this 28th day of February 1876. Congratulations, you're married. That'll be $2. Aurelia paid him from the small store of coins she kept for emergencies. Montgomery pocketed the money and jerked his thumb toward the door. "Off with you then, and good luck. You're going to need it." They rode back to Cross Creek Ranch as husband and wife, the certificate folded in Aurelia's saddlebag, and the reality of what they'd done settled over them like the cold. They were bound now, legally, irrevocably, for better or worse. When they reached the ranch, Tahitian helped her dismount, and they stood facing each other in the yard. "Well," Aurelia said. "That's done. Yes, that is done." He hesitated, then spoke carefully. "I know this marriage is not what you would have chosen if circumstances were different. I know I am not what you wanted. But I will honor my vows, Aurelia. I will work this land with you. I will defend it, and you with my life if necessary. I will not shame you or fail you. This I promise." The sincerity in his voice made something ache in Aurelia's chest. "I promise the same. We're partners now, equals. We'll face whatever comes together." She held out her hand and he took it. His grip was warm and strong and steady. They shook once, formally, sealing their agreement. Then they released and stepped back, and Aurelia felt the strangeness of the moment. She was married again to a man she barely knew, to a Comanche warrior who 3 weeks ago had been a stranger bleeding in the snow. Life was strange and unpredictable and occasionally insane. That night they ate dinner together at the small table Thomas had built years ago. Aurelia had made venison stew and fresh bread, and they ate in the same careful silence that had characterized all their meals. But there was something different now. A formality had been completed. A line had been crossed. They were husband and wife in the eyes of the law, even if they were still strangers in most ways that mattered. After dinner, Tahitan climbed to the loft and Aurelia retreated to her bedroom, and the house settled into the quiet rhythms of night. But Aurelia couldn't sleep. She lay in the darkness, thinking about the risk she'd taken, the gambles she'd made. She'd bound herself to a man she didn't love out of desperation and pragmatism. What if it was a mistake? What if he turned on her? What if the town's hostility escalated into violence? What if she'd just signed her own death warrant in her attempt to save the ranch? But then she thought about the alternative. Slow starvation, losing Cross Creek to debt or to men like Victor Ashford, who would swallow her land without a second thought. Dying alone and forgotten in a territory that had no use for weak women. At least this way she had a chance. At least this way she was fighting. Thomas would have understood that. Thomas had been a fighter too. She closed her eyes, and eventually sleep came, restless and full of dreams she couldn't quite remember in the morning. The real test of their arrangement came 5 days after the wedding. Aurelia woke to find the barn door hanging open and 3 of their 12 cattle missing. Fresh tracks in the snow led west toward the disputed grazing lands that bordered the property of a rancher named Clayton Maddox. Maddox was a hard man who believed in taking what he wanted and dealing with consequences later. He'd been angling for Cross Creek land ever since Thomas died, making lowball offers and veiled threats when Aurelia refused to sell. She'd suspected him of being behind some of her previous losses, cattle that had wandered off and never returned, but she'd never been able to prove it. Tahitan studied the tracks with the focus of a man reading a language most people couldn't see. 3 cattle, driven by 2 riders. They did not try to hide their trail. They want you to know it was them. His voice was calm, but his eyes were hard as obsidian. This is not theft. This is a challenge. It's both, Aurelia said, her jaw tight with anger. Maddox has been pushing me for months. He thinks I'm easy prey. He thinks I'll just roll over and let him take what he wants. What do you want to do? Tahitan asked. It was a test, Aurelia realized. He was asking if she wanted him to solve this problem, or if she wanted to handle it herself. If he was her partner or her protector. She appreciated that he was letting her choose. I want to ride to Maddox's ranch and get our cattle back. And I want you with me. Not because I need protection, but because you're my husband, and this is our problem now. Together, Tahitan nodded once. Then we ride together. They saddled Tempest and Flint and followed the tracks west. The trail was obvious, almost insultingly so, leading straight across the boundary markers that divided Cross Creek from Maddox land. They found the 3 missing cattle in a holding pen near Maddox's main barn, penned alongside at least a dozen other animals with brands that didn't match the Circle M that Maddox used. Stolen stock from multiple ranches, evidence of a pattern. Aurelia's anger crystallized into cold determination. This ended today. Clayton Maddox emerged from his ranch house as they rode into his yard. He was a bull of a man, thick through the shoulders and chest, with a red face and mean eyes. 2 of his ranch hands flanked him, both armed. Maddox's gaze flicked from Aurelia to Tahitan, and his lip curled. Well, well. The widow Walsh and her pet Savage. Heard you went and did something stupid, Walsh. Didn't believe it till now. "Those are my cattle in your pen, Maddox," Aurelia said, ignoring the insult. "I'm taking them back. Those cattle wandered onto my land. That makes them mine. Territorial law says any livestock found on private property without a clear owner becomes property of the landowner after 48 hours. It's been 5 days. Territorial law also says stealing livestock is a hanging offense," Aurelia countered. "And I can prove those are mine. They're wearing the Cross Creek brand. You want to argue this in front of Marshal Kane, or are you going to let me take what's mine and avoid the legal trouble?" Maddox's face darkened. "You threatening me, woman?" "I'm stating facts." Aurelia kept her voice level, but her hand was on the rifle strapped to her saddle. Beside her, she could feel Tahitian's stillness, the kind of stillness that preceded explosive action. "Now step aside. We're taking our cattle home. You're not taking anything. And if you push this, I'll make sure the marshal knows you're harboring a hostile Indian on your property. There's laws against that too. They could take your ranch, put you in jail, and hang your Comanche husband for good measure. Think about that before you make demands." It was a trap. Perfectly laid. Maddox had anticipated this confrontation and prepared his counter. Aurelia felt ice in her stomach. She'd underestimated him. But before she could respond, Tahitian spoke. His voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of absolute certainty. "You have stolen from my wife." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story. "You have insulted my wife. You have threatened my wife. These are 3 violations of honor that cannot stand. I give you 1 chance to make this right. Return the cattle, apologize, walk away, or I will make you regret that you were born." The ranch hands laughed nervously. Maddox's face went purple with rage. "You dare threaten me? On my own land? I'll see you dead before sundown, savage." "Then you will die first," Tahitian said, and there was no bravado in it, just flat statement of fact. He dismounted in one fluid motion and walked toward Maddox, with his hands empty and his stride unhurried. Maddox's hands went for his gun. Tahitian moved. 1 second he was 5 paces away. The next, he was inside Maddox's guard, his hand locked around the bigger man's wrist, the gun only half drawn. Tahitian twisted and Maddox screamed as bones cracked. The gun fell to the dirt. Tahitian swept Maddox's legs, and the man went down hard on his back, with Tahitian's knee on his chest and Tahitian's knife at his throat. The 2 ranch hands froze. Aurelia had her rifle up and aimed before they could decide whether to intervene. "Don't," she said coldly. "This is between them. You stay out of it and you walk away alive. You get involved and you die. Choose." They chose survival. Their hands moved away from their guns. A Tahitian looked down at Maddox, who was gasping like a landed fish, his eyes wide with shock and fear. "You are a coward who steals from women and hides behind hired guns. You are not worth killing. But if you ever threaten my wife again, if you ever set foot on our land, if you even speak her name without respect, I will find you, and I will finish this. Do you understand?" Maddox nodded frantically. Tahitian stood and stepped back, sheathing his knife. He looked at the ranch hands. "Open the pen. We are taking our cattle, and any other animals in there that do not belong here. Then we are leaving. If anyone follows us, I will assume you have chosen death." The ranch hands rushed to comply. Within minutes, Aurelia and Tahitian were driving not just their 3 cattle, but 7 others with mismatched brands out of Maddox's ranch. As they left, Aurelia looked back once. Maddox was still on the ground, cradling his broken wrist. The ranch hands were helping him up. The message had been delivered. Cross Creek Ranch was no longer easy prey. They drove the cattle home in silence. When they reached Cross Creek, they penned the 3 that were theirs and left the others in a separate enclosure. Aurelia would send word to the surrounding ranches that she'd recovered stolen stock, and owners could come claim what was theirs. It was the right thing to do. But more than that, it was smart. She was making allies, proving that she and Tahitian were forces for justice, not chaos. That night at dinner, Aurelia finally spoke. "Thank you for what you did today, for standing with me. "I am your husband," Tahitan said simply. "Where you stand, I stand." "That is what the vow means," Aurelia nodded, her throat tight. They were partners now. In every sense that mattered. And the ranch, their ranch, was beginning to feel like it might actually survive. Spring came to the Colorado high country the way it always did, grudgingly and with false starts. Snow melted during the day and froze again at night. The streams swelled with runoff that turned the valley into a patchwork of mud and stubborn ice. The cattle grew restless, sensing the change in seasons, and the work on Cross Creek Ranch doubled as Aurelia and Tahitan prepared for calving season and the drive to summer pastures. 2 months had passed since their wedding, and the arrangement that had begun as pure necessity had evolved into something neither of them had quite expected. Not love, not yet, but a partnership built on mutual respect and shared purpose that felt more solid than many marriages born from affection. The confrontation with Clayton Maddox had changed the dynamics in Redemption. Word spread quickly about how Tahitan had disarmed and humiliated the larger man without breaking a sweat, and about how Aurelia had recovered 7 ranchers' stolen cattle in one bold move. Suddenly, Cross Creek Ranch wasn't seen as easy prey anymore. Ranchers who'd lost stock to mysterious circumstances started approaching Aurelia at the general store, asking quiet questions about whether she'd noticed unusual activity near her land. Marshal Kane, ever the pragmatist, began consulting with Tahitan about tracking techniques when investigating thefts. It wasn't acceptance, not exactly, but it was acknowledgement. They were becoming part of the community's fabric, however reluctantly that fabric stretched to accommodate them. But not everyone was pleased with this development. Clayton Maddox's broken wrist had healed badly, leaving him with limited mobility in his right hand and a rage that burned hotter with each passing week. He'd been humiliated in front of his own men by a Comanche warrior and a woman, and in the harsh social mathematics of the frontier, humiliation demanded response. Maddox began spending long evenings at the saloon in Redemption, buying drinks and nursing grievances with anyone who would listen. He found willing ears among the men who'd never accepted Tahitan's presence, who saw him as a threat to their way of life, a reminder that the world was changing in ways they couldn't control. Seeds of resentment were planted and carefully watered with whiskey and wounded pride. Aurelia first noticed the shift in atmosphere during her weekly supply run to town. She entered the general store to find conversation dying abruptly, faces turning away, a coldness in the air that hadn't been there before. Mrs. Hennessy, usually warm and talkative, served her with clipped efficiency and averted eyes. When Aurelia asked if something was wrong, the older woman simply shook her head and wouldn't meet her gaze. The same thing happened at the feed store, at the bank, even at the church steps, where she'd stopped to speak with Reverend Blackwell about arranging a proper graveside service for Thomas on the anniversary of his death. The Reverend had looked uncomfortable and suggested perhaps it wasn't the right time. Perhaps emotions were running too high. Perhaps she should reconsider her living arrangements before asking for church blessings. She returned to the ranch angry and confused, and found Tahitan repairing the corral fence with methodical precision. He looked up as she dismounted, read her expression, and set down his hammer. "What happened?" She told him everything, watching his face carefully. He listened without interruption, his expression giving nothing away, but she saw his jaw tighten and his hands curl into fists. When she finished, he was silent for a long moment. "It is beginning," he said finally. "The backlash. We knew it would come. Men like Maddox do not forget humiliation. They gather others who think like them and they plan. We must be careful. Careful how? We've done nothing wrong. We work our land. We keep to ourselves. We've helped recover stolen property. What more can we do to prove we're not a threat?" "We cannot prove that," Tahitan said quietly, "because to men like Maddox, our existence is the threat. I'm Comanche living on land they believe should only belong to whites. You are a woman who refused to be helpless and chose her own path instead of accepting their protection. We represent change they fear. No amount of good behavior will change their minds. We can only be ready for what comes next." Aurelia knew he was right, but the unfairness of it burned in her chest. She'd followed every law, paid every debt, worked harder than most men in the valley, and still it wasn't enough. Still, she was being punished for daring to survive on her own terms. What do you think they're planning? I do not know yet, but I will find out. Tonight I will ride to town and listen. People talk more freely when they think no one is paying attention. He hesitated, then added, "You should stay here. Lock the doors. Keep your rifle close. If I am not back by dawn, ride to Marshal Kane. I'm not hiding in my own house while you take risks for me. You are not hiding. You are being smart. If something happens to both of us, there is no one to protect this ranch. One of us must be safe. Let it be you." The logic was sound even if Aurelia hated it. She nodded reluctantly and Tahitan left after sunset, moving silently into the darkness on foot rather than horseback. He taught himself to move through the mountain terrain like smoke, there and gone, before you could focus on him. Aurelia locked the doors as instructed, lit a single lamp, and sat at the table with her rifle across her knees. The house felt too empty and too full at the same time. She'd gotten used to his presence, she realized. The quiet sounds of him moving in the loft, the smell of the tobacco he occasionally smoked in his pipe, the knowledge that she wasn't alone. When had that happened? When had this stranger become someone whose absence left a hole? Tahitan returned 3 hours before dawn, slipping in through the back door so quietly that Aurelia jumped despite expecting him. He looked grim. "It is worse than I thought. Maddox has been spreading stories. He claims I attacked him unprovoked, that I threatened to kill his men, that I am the one who has been stealing cattle and blaming others to cover my tracks. He has convinced at least a dozen men that I am dangerous and need to be dealt with before I start a wider uprising among the local tribes." That's insane. There are witnesses who know what really happened, witnesses who will not speak against Maddox because they fear him or depend on him for work. And even if they did speak, would they be believed? I am Comanche. In the minds of many here, that makes me guilty of whatever I'm accused of. Taheton poured himself water from the pitcher and drank deeply. They are planning something. I could not get details, but I heard enough to know it will happen soon. Within days, maybe a week, Aurelia's mind raced through possibilities. An attack on the ranch, an ambush when they went to town, a legal maneuver to have Taheton arrested on false charges. We need to go to Marshal Kane, tell him what you heard. And say what? That I overheard men in a saloon talking? Kane will ask for specifics I cannot provide. He will ask for names I cannot give, without revealing I was eavesdropping. And even if he believes us, what can he do? Arrest men for having a conversation? The law does not work that way. Tahitan sat across from her, his exhaustion evident. We are on our own in this, Aurelia. We must be prepared to defend ourselves. I won't let them drive us off our land. Thomas built this ranch with his own hands. I've kept it alive through 3 years of hell. I'm not giving it up because some small-minded cowards are afraid of change. Tahitan smiled slightly, the first smile she'd seen from him in days. Good, then we fight. But we fight smart. We set watches. We never go anywhere alone. We make sure someone knows where we are at all times. And we document everything. Every threat, every strange occurrence, every piece of evidence that might prove conspiracy. If they come for us, we make sure the world knows we were not the aggressors. They spent the next week in a state of heightened vigilance that was exhausting but necessary. Tahitan rode the property line every morning, checking for signs of intrusion. Aurelia kept a journal documenting everything unusual, every hostile glance in town, every veiled threat. They took turns sleeping so one was always awake and alert. The cattle were moved closer to the house, where they could be watched. The horses were kept in the barn at night with the doors barred. It was like living under siege, and the not knowing when or how the attack would come was worse than the attack itself would be. The blow came from a direction neither of them anticipated. On a Tuesday morning in late April, Marshal Kane rode to Cross Creek Ranch with his deputy and 2 territorial rangers. Aurelia's heart sank when she saw the grim expressions on their faces. Kane dismounted slowly, his hand resting on his gun belt in a gesture that might have been casual but wasn't. "Mrs. Walsh, Mr. Teherton, we need to talk." "What's this about, Marshal?" Aurelia asked, stepping onto the porch with Teherton beside her. She'd been mucking stalls and was covered in dirt and straw, hardly the picture of dignity, but she held her head high anyway. Kane pulled a folded document from his coat. "I've received a formal complaint from Clayton Maddox. He claims that on March 3rd, your husband assaulted him on his own property, broke his wrist, threatened his life, and stole cattle belonging to him. He's demanding that Teherton be arrested and charged with assault, theft, and terroristic threatening." "That's a lie," Aurelia said flatly. "Maddox stole our cattle. We went to retrieve them and found 7 other stolen animals in his pen. Teherton defended us when Maddox drew a weapon. It was self-defense, not assault. Do you have witnesses to corroborate that version?" His 2 ranch hands were there. "They saw everything. I spoke to them. They claim Teherton attacked without provocation and that the cattle in question belonged to Maddox through legal salvage of abandoned stock." Kane's expression was sympathetic, but unyielding. "It's your word and theirs, Mrs. Walsh, and unfortunately, given the circumstances, the territorial judge is inclined to believe documented property owners over a Comanche man with no legal standing prior to your marriage. He has legal standing now. We're married. That makes him a citizen with full rights. That's a legal gray area that's being debated in territorial court. Until it's resolved, his status is questionable." Kane shifted his weight uncomfortably. "I don't want to do this, Mrs. Walsh, but I have to follow the law. Teherton needs to come with me to Redemption to face charges. There'll be a hearing in front of the judge next week. If he's innocent, it'll get sorted out. And if the judge is biased, if the hearing is rigged..." Teherton spoke for the first time, his voice calm but edged with steel. "I have seen frontier justice, Marshal. It does not favor men who look like me. If I go with you, I may not live to see trial. You have my word you'll be protected while in custody. Your word is not enough when angry men want blood." Teherton's hand moved to rest on the knife at his belt. Not a threat, but a statement. "I will not go peacefully to a cell where I can be murdered and called a suicide. If you want me, you will have to take me by force. Are you prepared to do that?" The tension ratcheted to a breaking point. The deputy's hand moved toward his pistol. The rangers shifted their positions to flank the porch. Marshal Kane held up a hand to forestall violence. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be, son. Running makes you look guilty. Standing my ground makes me look strong. There is a difference." Teherton met Kane's eyes without flinching. "I know what Maddox is doing. This is not about justice. This is about removing me so he can move against my wife without opposition. If I am gone, she is vulnerable. I will not allow that." Aurelia stepped forward, placing herself between Teherton and the lawman. "Marshal, you know this is wrong. You know Maddox is lying. Are you really going to arrest an innocent man just because it's easier than standing up to a bully?" Kane's face hardened. "I'm doing my job, Mrs. Walsh. Don't make me do something I'll regret." "Step aside." She didn't move. "No, you want him, you go through me. Mrs. Walsh, I can arrest you too for obstruction. Don't test me, then arrest me. Arrest us both. Throw us both in your jail. At least then we'll be together when Maddox's mob comes for us." Aurelia's voice rang with conviction that surprised even her. She wasn't backing down. Not now, not ever. Kane stared at her for a long moment, and something shifted in his expression. Respect, maybe, or recognition of just how far she was willing to go. He lowered his hand from his gun and took a step back. "I'll give you 48 hours. 2 days to figure this out. After that, I'm coming back with a warrant and enough men to take you both in by force, if necessary. Use that time wisely." He remounted his horse, and the other lawman followed suit. They rode away without looking back, and Aurelia watched them disappear down the valley road before her knees gave out. She sat heavily on the porch steps, her whole body shaking with adrenaline. Teherton sat beside her, close enough that their shoulders touched. "That was foolish," he said quietly. "Standing between me and armed lawmen. You could have been shot, so could you. At least this way we both survived." Aurelia let out a shaky laugh. 48 hours. What do we do with 48 hours? We prove Maddox is lying. We find evidence of his conspiracy. We go on the offensive instead of waiting to be destroyed. Tahitian stood and offered her his hand. She took it and let him pull her to her feet. We also prepare for the possibility that evidence will not be enough. If the law is corrupted, we may need to leave. Start over somewhere else. Leave Cross Creek? Never. This is our home. A home is people, not land. Wherever we are together, that is home. The land can be taken. We cannot. His words hit her harder than she expected. He was right, of course. The ranch was just dirt and timber and grass. What mattered was the life they were building, the partnership they'd forged. But abandoning Cross Creek felt like surrendering, like admitting Thomas's dream and her sacrifice had been for nothing. She couldn't do it, wouldn't do it, not without exhausting every other option first. They spent the rest of the day planning. Tahitian would ride to the surrounding ranches and speak with the men whose cattle they'd recovered from Maddox's pen, see if any would testify on their behalf. Aurelia would go through every piece of documentation she had, every bill of sale, every brand registration, every witness statement they'd collected since the incident. They needed an ironclad case that even a biased judge couldn't ignore. But even as they worked, Aurelia felt the weight of the hourglass running out. 48 hours wasn't enough time to overturn a conspiracy that had been brewing for months. They were fighting a war on terrain chosen by their enemy, with rules designed to ensure their defeat. That night, unable to sleep, Aurelia climbed the ladder to the loft, where Tahitian sat by the small window, looking out at the moonlit valley. He glanced at her as she settled beside him, but said nothing. They sat in silence for a while, comfortable in a way that still surprised her. Finally, she spoke. "If this goes wrong, if we have to run, where would we go? West to California, maybe? Or Oregon? Places where the law is newer and more flexible. Places where a mixed couple might be able to disappear into the crowds." He paused. "But I do not think it will come to that. You are not a person who runs, Aurelia, and I am not a person who hides. Whatever happens, we will face it here on this land together, even if it kills us. Even then, some things are worth dying for. Honor is one. Home is another. You are both." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning that went beyond their practical partnership. Aurelia turned to look at him, really look at him, and saw in his eyes something she hadn't expected to see. Not just respect or loyalty, but something deeper. Something that looked dangerously like the beginning of love. Her breath caught. When had that happened? When had this arrangement of convenience become something real? Before she could respond, before she could even process what she was feeling, a sound shattered the quiet. Breaking glass, shouting, the orange glow of fire suddenly visible through the window. Tahitian was on his feet instantly, grabbing his rifle. Aurelia scrambled down the ladder after him, and they burst out onto the porch to see their barn engulfed in flames. The horses were screaming inside, trapped. The heat was already intense, the fire spreading with impossible speed. This was no accident. Someone had doused the barn in accelerant and lit it deliberately. And somewhere in the darkness beyond the firelight, Aurelia heard laughter. "Get the horses!" she screamed, running toward the barn. Tahitian was faster, reaching the door first and kicking it open. Smoke billowed out, thick and choking. He plunged inside without hesitation, and Aurelia followed, her eyes streaming, her lungs burning. They found Tempest and Flint panicked in their stalls, wild with fear. Tahitian cut them loose, while Aurelia threw blankets over their heads to calm them enough to lead them out. One by one, they got the horses to safety, then went back for the milk cow and the calf that had been born 2 weeks ago. By the time they had all the animals clear, the barn was beyond saving. The roof collapsed inward with a roar, sending sparks spiraling into the night sky. Aurelia stood watching her barn burn, tears streaming down her face from smoke and grief and rage. Everything, feed stores, tools, tack, the seed she'd bought for spring planting, all of it gone. Months of work and years of accumulated resources destroyed in minutes. And in the darkness beyond the fire's light, she heard horses riding away, their hoofbeats fading into the night. Maddox's men. It had to be. This was the real attack, not the legal maneuvering. This was meant to break her spirit, destroy her means of survival, force her off the land through economic ruin. She turned to Tahitan, her face set in lines of absolute determination. No more waiting. No more defense. Tomorrow we end this. Dawn broke over the smoldering ruins of the barn, painting the sky in shades of ash and blood. Aurelia stood in the yard covered in soot, her hair singed, her hands blistered from beating out embers that had threatened to spread to the house. Tahitan moved through the wreckage with methodical purpose, salvaging what little could be saved. A few tools with fire-hardened handles, a length of chain, the iron hinges from the barn door. Everything else was carbon and memory. The financial loss was devastating. Easily $1,000 in materials and supplies she couldn't afford to replace. But worse than the money was the message. We can destroy you any time we want. You are not safe. You will never be safe. But Aurelia had stopped being afraid somewhere between midnight and dawn. Fear had burned away with the barn, leaving behind something harder and more dangerous. Cold fury, calculated determination. The understanding that some lines, once crossed, could never be uncrossed. Maddox had made this personal, had tried to destroy not just her livelihood but her future. And now she would make him pay for that mistake in ways he couldn't imagine. She watched Tahitan work for a few minutes, then called to him. "Leave it! We're going to town." They rode into Redemption 2 hours later, both still covered in soot and ash, their clothes reeking of smoke. They rode straight to Marshal Kane's office and dismounted without bothering to tie their horses. Kane looked up from his desk as they entered, took one look at their appearance, and stood slowly. "What happened?" Aurelia slammed her palm down on his desk, hard enough to make the papers jump. "Maddox burned our barn last night. His men came in the dark, doused it in accelerant, and lit it while our animals were trapped inside. We got them out, but everything else is gone. Tools, feed, seed, equipment. Thousands of dollars in damages. And I heard them laughing as they rode away." Kane's face went carefully neutral. "You saw them? Can you identify them?" "It was dark, but who else would it be? This happened less than 24 hours after you came to arrest Tahitan on Maddox's false charges. It's not coincidence, Marshal. It's escalation. He's trying to drive us off our land, and he doesn't care what laws he breaks to do it. Do you have proof? Evidence? Anything that directly ties Maddox to the fire? I have hoofprints. I have timing. I have motive. Isn't that enough?" Kane sat back down, rubbing his temples. "In a court of law. No, not without witnesses or physical evidence linking specific individuals to the crime. Hoofprints and suspicions won't convict anyone, Mrs. Walsh. You know that." He paused, then added more quietly, "But I believe you. Off the record, I believe Maddox is behind this. The man's been poisoned since his humiliation, and I've heard rumors about him organizing something. But my hands are tied without evidence that would hold up in court. Then what do you suggest we do? Sit and wait for him to burn the house next? Wait for him to kill us in our sleep? I suggest you be very careful. Document everything. Get witnesses if you can. And for God's sake, don't give Maddox any excuse to claim you're the aggressors." Kane looked at Tahitan, who'd been standing silent throughout the exchange. "The warrant for your arrest is still active. I gave you 48 hours. You've used 16 of them. That leaves 32 to figure this out." Tahitan finally spoke, his voice quiet but carrying absolute conviction. "We will figure it out, Marshal. One way or another, this ends today." There was something in his tone that made Kane's hand drift toward his gun. "Don't do anything stupid, son. Frontier justice cuts both ways, and if you take the law into your own hands, I'll have no choice but to come after you with everything I've got." "I understand," Tahitan said. "But understand this. My wife's life has been threatened. Her property has been destroyed. Men have tried to drive her from land that is legally hers. I will not stand by and watch that continue. I will do what honor demands." They left before Kane could respond. Outside, Aurelia grabbed Tahitan's arm. "What are you planning?" "The truth. We are going to force Maddox to confess in front of witnesses, and we are going to do it in a way that leaves no doubt about his guilt." His eyes were hard as flint. "But I need you to trust me and let me handle this my way. Can you do that?" Aurelia studied his face, seeing the warrior beneath the ranch hand, the strategist beneath the wounded stranger she'd saved. This was who Tehitan really was, she realized. Not just a survivor, but a fighter who understood how to win battles that couldn't be won with fists alone. "I trust you. What do you need me to do?" "Go to Dutch Carmody. Tell him what happened. Ask him to gather every rancher who has been victimized by Maddox's thefts. Tell them to come to Maddox's ranch at noon. Tell them we are going to prove who the real thief is, but we need witnesses to make it stick. Can you do that?" She nodded, and Tehitan continued. "I am going to Maddox's ranch now. Alone. I'm going to make him an offer he cannot refuse, and I'm going to record his response. By noon we will have everything we need." "What kind of offer?" "The kind that appeals to his greed and his arrogance. The kind that will make him talk." Tehitan mounted Tempest and looked down at her. "If I'm not at Maddox's ranch by noon, something has gone wrong. Tell Marshal Kane everything and let him sort it out. But I will be there. I promise you that." He rode north before she could argue. Aurelia watched him go, her heart in her throat, then mounted Flint and rode hard for Dutch Carmody's ranch. She found the older man in his barn and laid out the situation in quick, urgent sentences. Dutch listened with growing anger, his weathered face darkening with each detail. "That son of a bitch burned your barn? With animals inside?" He spat into the dirt. "That's beyond the pale. That's evil. Count me in. And I'll bring every rancher in the valley who's had stock go missing. It's time we settled accounts with Maddox once and for all." By 11:30, Aurelia was riding toward Maddox's ranch with Dutch and 9 other ranchers. A small army of angry men who'd finally had enough. They carried rifles, but Aurelia prayed they wouldn't need them. Violence would only give Maddox ammunition for his claims that Tehitan was dangerous. They needed justice, not bloodshed. They needed proof. She just hoped Tehitan had found it. As they crested the ridge overlooking Maddox's property, Aurelia saw a scene that made her blood run cold. Tehitan stood in Maddox's yard, surrounded by Maddox and 6 of his ranch hands, all armed. Tehitan's hands were empty, his posture relaxed, but Aurelia could see the tension in the set of his shoulders. This was a powder keg waiting for a spark. Dutch saw it too. "Jesus, what's he doing down there alone?" "Whatever it takes," Aurelia said and urged Flint forward. The other ranchers followed. They rode into Maddox's yard in a group, and suddenly the odds had shifted. Maddox's men looked uncertain, hands hovering near weapons but not drawing. Maddox himself looked furious, his face purple with rage. "What the hell is this? You bringing a mob to my property, Walsh?" "Not a mob, witnesses." Aurelia dismounted and walked to stand beside Tehitan. Up close, she could see a thin cut on his cheek and his shirt torn at the shoulder. There'd been a scuffle. But he was standing, and he gave her a small nod that said everything was going according to plan. "These men are here to hear what you have to say, Maddox. About the thefts, about the barn, about all of it. I don't have to say a damn thing to you or your savage husband or these fools you dragged along. Actually, you do," Tehitan said calmly. He reached into his shirt and pulled out a small leather journal, the kind used for keeping ranch accounts. He opened it to a marked page and began reading. "March 15th. Took 3 head from the Walsh place. Easy work. Woman's too weak to stop us. March 23rd. Hit the Carmody Ranch. 5 head of prime beef. Old man never even noticed. April 2nd. Brennan's horses. 4 mares. Should fetch good money in Denver." Tehitan looked up, his eyes locked on Maddox. "Should I continue?" Maddox's face went from purple to white. "Where did you get that? That's private property." "I took it from your office this morning while you and your men were eating breakfast. You should lock your doors better." Tehitan held up the journal so the assembled ranchers could see it. "This contains a record of every theft Maddox has committed in the past year. Dates, locations, numbers of animals, all in his own handwriting. And there's more." He pulled out a sheaf of papers. "Bills of sale for livestock sold in Denver and Colorado Springs. The brands don't match Maddox's Circle M. They match yours, Dutch. And yours, Brennan. And yours, Walsh. He's been stealing from all of you and selling your stock as his own." The ranchers erupted in angry shouts. Dutch Carmody pushed forward, his hand on his gun. "You thieving bastard! I lost 20 head over the winter. Near ruined me. And it was you the whole time." Maddox backed toward his house, his men forming a protective circle around him. "That's stolen property, evidence obtained illegally. Won't hold up in any court." "Maybe not," Tahitan agreed. "But there's one more thing." He pulled a final item from his pocket, a silver concho, the kind used to decorate saddles and tack. "I found this in your barn this morning, in a pile of items that didn't belong there. Women's jewelry, a child's toy soldier, a Bible with the Hendricks name inside." He let that sink in. The Hendricks family had been killed 6 months ago, their homestead burned, their stock scattered. Everyone had assumed it was Indians. "You didn't just steal cattle, Maddox. You murdered that family, took everything they had, and burned the evidence." The silence was absolute. Even Maddox's own men were staring at him with horror and dawning realization. One of them, a young cowhand named Billy, took a step back from his boss. "Is that true, Mr. Maddox? Did you kill the Hendricks family?" Maddox's facade cracked. Rage and desperation warred on his face. "They saw us taking their cattle. They were going to report us to the marshal. We didn't have a choice." The admission hung in the air like a death sentence. Dutch Carmody drew his pistol. "You son of a bitch! Sarah Hendricks was my cousin. Those were her kids you murdered." Other ranchers drew their weapons. Maddox's men scattered, unwilling to die for a boss who just confessed to murder. Maddox himself grabbed for his gun, but Tahitan was faster. He closed the distance in 2 strides and struck Maddox's wrist with the edge of his hand, the same wrist he'd broken months ago. Maddox screamed and dropped the gun. Tahitan kicked it away and forced Maddox to his knees. "You wanted to destroy us," Tahitan said quietly, his voice carrying to every witness. "You wanted to drive us from our land because you could not stand that we succeeded where you thought we should fail. You burned our barn. You stole our cattle. You tried to use the law as a weapon against us, but you forgot something important. Justice does not care about the color of a man's skin or the prejudices in his heart. Justice cares about truth, and the truth has destroyed you." He looked at Dutch. "Tie him up. We are taking him to Marshal Kane. Let the law handle him now." Marshal. Kane was in his office when the procession arrived, Maddox bound and sitting on his horse, surrounded by armed ranchers who looked ready to lynch him if he so much as breathed wrong. Kane listened to the story, examined the evidence, and read Maddox's journal with an expression that grew darker with each page. When he finished, he looked at Maddox with pure contempt. "Clayton Maddox, I'm arresting you for theft, arson, conspiracy, and the murders of James, Sarah, and their 2 children, the Hendricks family. You'll be held in territorial custody until the circuit judge arrives, and may God have mercy on your soul, because no jury in this territory will." He turned to his deputy. "Lock him up. Maximum security. And if anyone tries to visit him, I want to know about it." As Maddox was led away, screaming threats and promises of revenge that rang hollow, Kane turned to Tahitan. "That was one hell of a gamble you took, breaking into his property, stealing his records. If he'd caught you, he could have killed you legally and claimed self-defense." "But he did not catch me," Tahitan said simply. "And now justice is served." Kane actually smiled, small and grudging but real. "The charges against you are dropped, officially. And I'll be writing a letter to the territorial governor recommending you be granted full citizenship rights. You've done this community a service today." He looked at Aurelia. "Both of you have. I'm sorry I didn't see what Maddox was doing sooner. I should have protected you better." "You protect us now by making sure he hangs," Aurelia said. "That's all we ask." They left the marshal's office to find a crowd had gathered, news spreading through redemption like wildfire. The ranchers whose stock had been recovered were already talking about forming a fund to help rebuild the Cross Creek barn. Dutch Carmody clapped Tahitian on the shoulder. "You're a good man. Don't care what color you are or where you come from. You got honor, and that's what counts. Anyone gives you trouble from here on out, they answer to me and every man here. You understand?" Tahitian nodded, clearly moved. "I understand. Thank you." As they rode back to Cross Creek, the afternoon, sun warm on their faces, Aurelia felt something inside her chest release. The threat was gone. The conspiracy was broken. They were safe. For the first time since Tahitian had collapsed in the street with Tempest's reins in his hands, she could breathe without fear tightening her lungs. She looked at the man riding beside her, this stranger who'd become her partner, her protector, her husband, in all the ways that truly mattered. "Thank you," she said, "for everything, for fighting for us, for being brave enough to risk everything." "I did not do it for gratitude," Tahitian said. "I did it because this is my home now. You are my home, and I will defend what is mine with everything I have." The words were simple, but they hit Aurelia with the force of revelation. Somewhere in the past months, without either of them quite noticing, their arrangement had transformed into something real. This wasn't just partnership anymore. This was love, hard-won and battle-tested and stronger for all the trials that had forged it. She reached across the space between their horses and took his hand. He looked surprised, then smiled and held on tight. Summer transformed the Colorado high country into something almost gentle. The snow retreated to the highest peaks. Wildflowers carpeted the meadows in riots of purple and gold, and the cattle grew fat on grass that seemed to spring up overnight. Cross Creek Ranch buzzed with activity as neighbors came to help rebuild the barn, a structure that rose larger and stronger than the one that had burned. Dutch Carmody supervised the framing. The Brennan brothers handled the roofing. Even Marshall. Kane showed up one Saturday with his son to help raise the walls. It was a barn raising in the old tradition, the community coming together to help one of their own, and for the first time since Thomas's death, Aurelia felt like she truly belonged here. Tahitian worked alongside the other men with quiet competence, and Aurelia watched the way they began to accept him, not with fanfare or dramatic declarations, but through the small gestures that mattered. Dutch asking his opinion on beam placement. Young Billy, who'd quit Maddox's employ the day of the confrontation, seeking Tahitian's advice on breaking a difficult horse. The Brennan brothers inviting him to join their weekly poker game, respect earned through shared labor and proven character. By the time the barn was finished in early July, Tahitian had become simply one of the ranchers in the valley, his past mattering less than his present. The trial of Clayton Maddox lasted 3 days and ended with a guilty verdict on all counts. The judge, a stern man who'd traveled from Denver specifically for this case, showed no mercy. Maddox was sentenced to hang for the murder of the Hendricks family, with additional consecutive sentences for theft, arson, and conspiracy that would have kept him in prison for life, even if the hanging sentence was somehow overturned. The execution was scheduled for late August. Aurelia didn't plan to attend. She had no desire to watch a man die, even one who'd tried to destroy her. Justice had been served, and that was enough. She could let the past stay buried and focus on building her future. That future became clearer one evening in mid-July when Aurelia and Tahitian sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of amber and rose. They'd fallen into this routine over the past months, these quiet moments at day's end where they could simply exist together without the demands of ranch work pressing on them. Tahitian had his pipe, Aurelia had her mending, and between them was a companionable silence that felt more intimate than conversation. But tonight, Aurelia set aside her sewing and spoke the words that had been building in her heart for weeks. "I need to tell you something." Tahitian lowered his pipe, his dark eyes attentive. "I am listening. When I agreed to marry you, it was a business arrangement, a partnership born from necessity. I needed help and you needed a home, and it made practical sense for both of us." She paused, choosing her words carefully, but somewhere along the way, it became more than that. Somewhere between fighting, off Maddox and rebuilding the barn, and just living our lives together, I stopped thinking of you as my partner and started thinking of you as my husband. The real kind, the kind I want to spend my life with, not because I have to, but because I choose to. Tahitian was very still, his expression unreadable in the fading light. When he spoke, his voice was rough with emotion he didn't try to hide. "Are you saying what I think you are saying?" "I'm saying I love you, Tahitian. I don't know when it happened exactly. Maybe when you stood between me and those lawmen. Maybe when you risked your life to expose Maddox. Maybe it was earlier, in 100 small moments I didn't recognize at the time. But it happened, and I needed you to know." She took a breath. "I'm also saying that if you want to move out of the loft and into my room, into our room, I would like that. If you want the same thing." He set down his pipe with hands that trembled slightly, then reached for her. His palm cupped her cheek, warm and calloused and infinitely gentle. "I have loved you since the day I woke to find you stitching my wounds with hands that shook but never faltered. I have loved you through every trial we have faced. I have loved you in silence because I did not think I had the right to ask for more than you had already given me." His thumb brushed across her cheekbone. "But if you are offering me not just your partnership but your heart, then yes. Yes to all of it. Yes to being your husband in every way. Yes to building a life that is not just about survival, but about joy. Yes to loving you openly, instead of hiding it like a secret I had no right to keep." Aurelia closed the distance between them and kissed him. Not the careful, formal kiss they'd shared at their wedding ceremony, but a real kiss, deep and desperate, and full of all the feelings they'd been holding back for months. His arms came around her, pulling her close, and she felt the steady beat of his heart against hers. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Aurelia laughed. A real laugh, bright and unguarded. "We should probably go inside," she said. "The neighbors might talk." "Let them talk," Tahitian said, but he stood and offered her his hand. She took it and let him lead her into the house, up to the bedroom that had been hers alone for 3 years and would now be theirs together. They closed the door on the past and on the world outside, and in the sanctuary of their home, they became husband and wife in the fullest sense of the word. The following months brought a rhythm to their lives that felt almost miraculous in its ordinary beauty. They worked the ranch together, their movements synchronized through practice and intuition. Tahitian proved to have a gift for training horses, and word spread quickly. Ranchers from across the territory began bringing him their difficult animals, paying good money for his patience and skill. Aurelia focused on rebuilding the cattle herd, using Tempest's foal, a strong colt born in September, as the foundation for a breeding program that would take years to fully develop, but promised long-term prosperity. They weren't rich, but they were stable, and stability felt like wealth after years of desperate struggle. In October, Marshal Kane stopped by with news. "Thought you'd want to know. The territorial governor approved Tahitian's citizenship application. You're official now. Full rights and protections under the law." He handed over a document bearing an impressive seal. "Congratulations. You've earned this 10 times over." Tahitian accepted the paper with hands that weren't quite steady. Aurelia knew what it meant to him, this tangible proof that he belonged, that he was no longer a man living on the margins, but a recognized member of society. He'd never spoken much about the loss of his people, the displacement and grief that had shaped him, but she understood that this document represented a new beginning, a place in a world that had tried very hard to erase him. That winter was the mildest in years, as if the land itself was offering them respite after the trials they'd endured. They spent long evenings by the fire, reading aloud from books Aurelia ordered from Denver, teaching each other their languages, sharing stories from their different childhoods. Tahitian told her about growing up in a Comanche band, about learning to ride before he could walk, about the songs his mother had sung and the wisdom his father had shared. Aurelia told him about Boston, about society balls and rules of etiquette that seemed absurd in retrospect, about the day she'd met Thomas and decided to trade predictability for adventure. They learned each other the way cartographers learn terrain, with patience and attention and growing wonder at the landscape they were discovering. Spring brought its own gift. Aurelia woke one morning in late March, feeling queasy, and by mid-April she was certain. She was pregnant. The realization was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. She'd never been a mother. She'd barely been a wife in the conventional sense. But when she told Tahitian, watching his face transform from confusion to understanding to pure joy, she knew this was right. This was the future they'd been building toward without even realizing it. A family, a legacy, something that would outlast both of them and prove that love could bridge any divide. "We are going to have a child," Tahitian said, wonder in his voice. He placed his hand on her still flat stomach with a reverence that made her eyes sting with tears. "A child who will belong to both our worlds, who will carry both our blood and both our stories." "This is a miracle, Aurelia. This is terrifying," she countered, but she was smiling. "I don't know how to be a mother. What if I'm terrible at it? Then you will learn, the way you learned to run a ranch and fight for what is yours and love a broken stranger who brought you a stolen horse. You are the strongest person I have ever known. You will be an extraordinary mother." His certainty steadied her. They would face this together, the way they'd faced everything else. As equals, as partners, as two people who'd found in each other the home they'd both been searching for. The baby, a daughter, was born in November during the first snowfall of the season. She came into the world squalling with indignation, her tiny fists waving, and when Aurelia held her for the first time, she understood what Thomas had meant when he talked about building something that would last generations. This child was that legacy. Not the land, not the ranch, not the cattle or horses, or any of the material things they'd fought so hard to protect. This child, with her father's dark eyes and her mother's stubborn chin, was the future made flesh. They named her Sarah after the Hendricks woman who'd been murdered, a reminder that justice mattered and that some debts could only be paid forward. As Aurelia sat in the rocking chair Thomas had made years ago, her daughter asleep in her arms and her husband standing guard by the window watching the snow fall, she thought about the journey that had brought them here. The theft, the wounds, the desperate bargain, the trials and the triumphs. She thought about the man who'd risked his last breath to bring her stolen horse back and then knelt asking for her heart as payment. She'd given it grudgingly at first, then willingly and finally completely. And in return, she'd received more than she'd ever thought possible. A partner, a protector, a love that had been tested by fire and had emerged stronger for it. "What are you thinking?" Tahitian asked, turning from the window. "I'm thinking about debts," Aurelia said. "About how you brought back Tempest and asked for my hand, and how I thought I was the one doing you a favor by accepting. But I was wrong. You saved me in every way a person can be saved. You gave me hope when I had none. You gave me strength when I was breaking. You gave me a future I thought was lost forever. So I'm wondering, when does my debt to you get paid?" Tahitian crossed the room and knelt beside the rocking chair, his hand covering hers where it rested on their daughter's back. "There is no debt between us, Aurelia. There never was. We saved each other. We chose each other. And we will keep choosing each other every day for the rest of our lives. That is not obligation. That is love." And in that moment, in the warm sanctuary of their home, with their daughter sleeping peacefully and the snow falling soft outside, Aurelia Walsh understood that some bargains transcend transaction. Some partnerships become something sacred, and some loves forged in desperation and tempered in trial, become the kind of forever that even death cannot diminish. They had built their home not from timber and nails, but from honor and trust, and the courage to believe that two broken people could become whole together. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.